in New York for a number of years and had his own office in Washington, D.C. for some time. While he maintained his own office in Washington, he was fortunate to produce projects in 9 different states in the country, and he's done work that's been built in 4 different foreign countries. All of the projects that he's worked on have been mostly large projects, million-square-foot office buildings, one of those in Washington, D.C., and one of his more recent projects, which was a university campus for Indonesia. Many of the works that he's done have been published, and he himself has written 2 books. He's also designed furniture and graphics and has, on occasion, done a lot of work in photography. He's spoken in over 50 professional seminars in his career, and prior to coming to Ball State almost 5 years ago now, he taught at Cornell University. So he comes from obviously a long background of very distinguished involvement in the profession. It's my pleasure to introduce Sonne Palmer. $199.98. Is that the way you do it, Jerry? Can you hear me? 9 states, and those include state of confusion, state of perplexity, etc. When I left Texas, or about the time I was about to leave Texas to go to New York to graduate school, Charles Lawrence, who is a principal of Caudill, Rowlett and Scott, said that he would like to give me some advice. And the advice was that there are 2 kinds of architects: those that do architecture and those that talk about architecture. I think probably, he went on to say that I should be a doer and not a talker. In any case, I think probably in the early 60s this may have been true. But I think there has been a change that has come about in the last few years, and we find that it's probably very difficult to separate the doers from the talkers. Certainly, we know that in the last couple of years, probably 5, there have probably been more architectural books published than in any other equal period of time ever. If we look at just last year, 1981, we can see that several things have come about in which people are talking more and more about architecture, as well as doing, I think, more and more about architecture. You might say that the postmodern movement has had something to do with this. One of the first things that happened last year, 1981, was that Leon Cryer wrote a book entitled "Why is British Architecture So Lousy?" Shortly thereafter, Aldo van Eyck responded with an article entitled "Rat, Post, and Pest," in which he stated that those things that Cryer was talking about had already been stated some 10 years earlier in the Team 10 primer. I don't know that it's so important that the issues had been stated before, but what happened was that Van Eyck, and others for that matter, took on a debate that involved architects talking about their own work. Also last year, we saw several things happening with various speakers, even speakers that came to this college, such as Stanley Tigerman was here a couple of years ago, and basically all he did was show his work. In 1981, he came, and in addition to showing his work, he talked about the issue of division and how his work related to that issue, as well as he tried, I shouldn't say he tried, he took the opportunity to explain that from his point of view, postmodern architecture was a Jewish movement. Charles Moore came here and talked about water and the historical uses of water, and then showed some of his own work. For those of you that went down to Cincinnati to listen to Michael Graves, you know that Michael Graves talked for about 2 hours. And for about 20 minutes he talked about walls, basically classical walls. For about an hour and a half he talked about his own work. And for about 10 minutes he talked about how badly designed the room that he was speaking in was, as well as how bad several other architects were. I thought the first 20 minutes were really worthwhile. Also, in 1981, a number of non-architects got into the act. Tom Wolfe, in his book, From Bauhaus to Our House, or is it the other way around, from our house, whatever. I don't think that needs comment, at least not from me. Everyone's talking about that particular book. More importantly, during the summer, Helen Searing at Smith College, also a non-architect, put together an exhibit that probably was one of the major high points of last year, and that was an exhibit entitled Speaking a New Classicism, American Architecture Now. That exhibit began to define some of the issues related with the postmodern movement. Now, the new classicism, in a sense, jumps back over the modern movement and goes back to some of the grassroots, some of the principles, some of the basic issues that we have studied in architectural history, and bring them to today and apply them in a contemporary way. And it's this going back in time that is what I would like to do in a way tonight. It's my opinion that all examples of architecture that have been judged good by architects, architectural critics, historians, have a common set of denominators. And these denominators can be defined, they can be discussed, and they can be the point of describing, let's say, architectural projects. For what it's worth, there are a number of people that are doing similar things as some of the things I'll be talking about tonight, such as Klaus Herdick and Ken Frampton at Columbia, Clark and Paws at North Carolina State. In fact, those last two people have published a book which describes some of the things that I'll be talking about. The list is quite long. I would like to just simply hit the high points, and then I would like to pull out two of these items or elements and use those to discuss several projects tonight. Quickly, these common denominators are correlation, that is, a functional or programmatic issues that relate to orientation, to site elements, and can be described graphically. Siting, the relationship of exterior spaces to the building, orientation, access, movement, environment, and context. Graphic composition, having to do with zoning, footprint, circulation, and the graphic balance of spaces. That is one that I will pull out and discuss tonight. Entry and enclosure, which has more to do with how a building meets the ground than it has to do with anything else, and may or may not represent a building profile. Structure, which gives order or is an ordering component, and should be considered from the point of view of pattern and zoning rather than from structural issues of force, shear, compression, tension. Patterns and rhythms, which really are looked at usually in terms of the surface of a building, but in fact transcend the building and go cut through it. That is the second item that I would like to look at tonight. Also scale and proportion, image, not in terms of building character, but rather in terms of issues such as open versus closed, private, public, hard, soft, background, foreground buildings. And obviously, how all of these go together relates, how all these go together, whether it is complex or diverse, usually separates good buildings from really good buildings. I would like to now take a whole series of projects. The title of this lecture tonight was something like Architectural Concepts and Anonymous Architecture, and primarily I'll be talking about anonymous architecture, but I would also like to take a few buildings that you're probably familiar with to first set the stage for these two topics. Now, I have chosen purposefully tonight not to deal with buildings that we normally look at in architectural history classes, that is European, Western architecture, but rather to concentrate on projects in this hemisphere, that is to say, primarily pre-Columbian architecture. So there are 2 points that are happening here. One is that I believe that we can learn as much from pre-Columbian architecture as we can from the Greeks, the Egyptians, etc. And the second point is obvious, that I would like to apply the 2 principles or the 2 elements that I've discussed. Rather than describe those again, I would like to start with the slides, and I believe using first 3 projects, I can best describe these 2 issues. So the lights. This project is awfully close. I think you're all familiar with this project. What I would like for you to look at is the drawing on the right, in which we can see the first issue I mentioned, that is graphic composition of plan. Now, in this case, I believe that it's fair to say, because we know Corbusier's work, we know that he developed the module and his buildings are designed from the module, that it's possible to take the floor plan of Ronchamp and by moving backwards come to the doodle on the left there, which indicates the module and the possibility of how these walls may have gone together. Then moving back across the sheet, you see that through manipulation of the plan, it begins to change, and obviously in the third doodle on the right, you see the plan as it is here. Now, under no stretch of the imagination am I trying to make the point that this is precisely what Corbusier did. That's not my intent here tonight with this project or other projects we'll be looking at, but rather to say that in the process of analyzing this project and others, it's possible for me to better understand how a project as complex as this could have been manipulated. That is to say, how the design may have evolved. We all know that no telling how many people have also analyzed this building, and the analysis probably all differ. Again, my point here is basically to show that you start out with something very simple, it evolves, and through manipulation, a more complex and I think a more exciting plan comes about. The second project, which does not have two hills in the title, by Venturi, it's not the plan in this case I would like to show you, but rather the elevation. But first, the plan comes about, as you can see on the right. At the top, you have the lower level, the middle, the second floor, and at the bottom, I believe, one possibility of the graphic composition from which this plan may have come. It's really the elevation, though, that I find more interesting, because it is a very complex situation that this elevation may have come from. Now, if we look at this closely, we see that from top to bottom we have an even series of modules. And if we look more closely, we see that each one of these divides into quarter points. And while this sketch is done on a 3x5 card, I have actually laid this out so I know that these quarter points relate to various positions in the plan. And this is true all the way from bottom to top in this project. In the other dimension, we find that the grid is much more complex, and it begins in the center with a module of 1, goes to 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, and then is divided into third points, so that each one of these third points relates to some point in the facade. And all the pieces of the facade, right down to, as you see on the left here, the mullions in the window, all relate to those two modules. Now, I suppose it's fair to say that Venturi may have started with an equal module and found that it did not work. That is, a grid that was the same in both directions. In any case, I think that we see here that through the manipulation of a rigid grid, we can see that it is possible that this design may have come from that. The third project also has to do with elevation, and in this case we have something completely different happening. This is a project that was completed last year, I believe. It was published in the summer. And in this case we find a layering of information. That is to say that we can look at this in pieces, and we can see that if we look at just the center, we find that it is absolutely symmetrical around the center point here, with the exception of these two windows, which are not in a symmetrical position. We move to the next set of, the next layer, and we find that this particular piece, as well as this one, is absolutely symmetrical, except what happens back inside this lower piece. On the right we have a window, a door, a bay window, and on the left a window, a sliding door, and a small window. So you can see in the middle only one thing was out of symmetry. At the second level, more is out of symmetry, and we can have some fun with this because probably the third level or third layer was also symmetrical, but the budget wouldn't permit it being built, so now I think you can, I hope you can at least, see what the two issues are. One has to do with plan and the manipulation of plans. The second has to do with elevations, primarily, and the manipulation of various pieces of elevations. So with that, to look at some pre-Columbian structures, this is Aztec Pueblo, as it says there in Mesa Verde, New Mexico. This is a city that was built, I believe, about 1200 AD. I believe that it's possible to look at this particular building and see that there is an inferred geometric plan which is made of a series of rectangles with a couple of circles in the middle. Now, I know that a number of people would say that's ridiculous. They did not plan that way. They planned it some other way. I'm not so sure of that, because when we look at the things that came before the Pueblos, we can find very strong and very rigid and very pure geometry in pre-Columbian architecture, such as the mounds that are only a few miles from here in near Anderson. Also, the various other mounds around this part of the country. And as you may have read just recently, very sophisticated layering and multiplying of hexagons in mounds that were found in Louisiana. So we know that the people that existed before the Pueblos were able to maintain very pure geometries. So I think it's fair, or at least I would like to take the risk of saying I believe that it's possible that they started with this particular inferred geometry, but they found that in manipulating it, they could have a much more exciting and a much more alive, let's say, plan. Here you see it in figure ground, negative on the left, positive on the right. Another project, Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, we find a simpler form that is a half circle with a couple of hubs, one slightly off. I know that those people those students that are in Jack Wells' class, you have looked at this project probably from another point of view. And for what it's worth, we all know that we can take the Pueblos and look at them from many different points of view. What I'm doing here, obviously, is just related to that one issue that I've chosen to discuss tonight, in this case, manipulated geometry. In this case, the actual plan, again, is manipulated into something that I think is much more exciting than the flatness of the first drawing. The third one is Taoni Pueblo in Bandelier, and in some ways it's the most sophisticated because it's a series of circles. There is a larger circle which is sliced here as an entry, and then the layering of two circles. Actually, the outer piece of this circle implies that there is that has been taken away. And here again we see what I think is one of the most sophisticated of all the plans of the Pueblos. You'll notice that all of these that are shown here are plans that have been taken from those Pueblos that are out on the plains. They do not include those that are stuffed into the sides of the hills simply because they did not have the opportunity to manipulate the floor plans quite as much in those cases. Now, it's pure speculation on my part that the Pueblos came about in the ways that I have projected here. I know that the inferred geometric order in the first slides are speculation. However, if we move farther south into Mexico, it's possible to trace various cities, and I believe we can substantiate that the manipulation of geometry in city planning was, in fact, a planning tool. For what it's worth, those pueblos are about here. In and around Mexico City, there are a group of pre-Columbian cities, also around Oaxaca, and we will primarily tonight be talking about the Mayan cultures, and they are in the Yucatan Peninsula, all across here, down into the state of Chiapas, into the country of Guatemala, Belize, so it's a very large area. Now, La Venta, an Olmec city, which on the map would be right about where the point of the arrow is considered to be, I won't say the oldest, but certainly one of the oldest cities in Mexico. And it's a very important city because in this city we find all of the elements that show up in all of the cities in Middle America up until the time of the Spanish. And those issues are really only two. One has to do with central axis, which you see here in the dot and dash line. The second has to do with enclosure. In this particular city, what we have here, what you're looking at, is on the right a pyramid, which is pounded earth, very similar to the mounds over near Anderson. At this point, we have a ball court, which shows up through most of the pre-Columbian cities in this part of the world. Here, these are mounds which simply form enclosure around a plaza, and this is a burial ground which is literally beneath the surface. Now, if we move to one of the most sophisticated cities, an Aztec city which is actually just outside of Mexico City, we see that the two principles that were established in the Olmec city of La Venta are here. First, the central axis, which in this case is over a mile long. Also secondary axes, which you see at various points. I'll try to focus this. And also you can see various places of enclosure. In fact, this is a very large city. You'll also notice that it's very rigid. All of the axes are perpendicular to each other. All are straight in that the symmetry is very rigid in every piece, and so forth. In another city, which on the map is just southeast of Oaxaca, is the Mixtec city of Mitla, and in here, this is high in the mountains, by the way, we have an issue of enclosure taken to the extreme that the axes were taken in the previous city. Now, these axes do not perfectly line up from one to another. Consequently, I did not extend them. I think there is an axis around each group of buildings, but in fact it's the enclosure that is more important here. Now, the reason I've chosen to primarily talk about the Mayans, two reasons. One is Susan and I were there last spring, so it's still fresh on our minds. Secondly, the Mayans were a wonderfully complex and sophisticated culture. Briefly, they existed from about 5000 BC to 1550 AD, the time of the Spanish invasion. They were sophisticated in the sense that they had their own alphabet, their own language, no telling how many books, which were all destroyed except for 3 by the Spanish, many vast libraries. They were incredible astronomers. They were able to calculate the orbit of Venus and miss it only by 6 minutes. They had a calendar which was more complex, consequently more sophisticated and more accurate than our calendar. They were terrific mathematicians, including the use of zero. And yet at the same time they were considered Stone Age in the sense that they did not have the wheel. For all practical purposes, they did not use metal. They had no domesticated cattle or animals except for dogs. And yet this kind of Stone Age culture on one hand was a highly accomplished culture on the other. Some of their greatest accomplishments, in my opinion, were in their cities and in their planning and their design and in their buildings. And so I would like to talk about some of those tonight. The cities we'll be looking at are in and around Merida, just south of Merida, east of Merida, and the last one over on the coast. As you leave Merida and go south, at some point you see here, you can see a building, and that building is the Pyramid of the Magician at Uxmal. Now I would like to start with the city of Uxmal because it was the last city built by the Mayans. In fact, let me rephrase that. It's the last city built by the Mayans during the Mayan classical period. That is to say, after 909, the Mayans politically were influenced by the Aztecs and Toltecs from central Mexico, so consequently their cities and their architecture began to change. We'll come back to this in a moment. First, I would like to go to this building. This is called the Governor's Palace. Most of the names, incidentally, are translations from the Spanish. This particular building you may have seen because it is the same facade that occurs on the administration building of the University of Mexico in Mexico City. What I would like for you to look at first are these squares that occur in the frieze being this portion of the building. You can't see them quite on the left, but I think if we look closer, well, I messed up there. If you look closer, you can see them here. Those establish, I believe, a module from which this building is designed. Now, if you look at this closely, you'll see that all the pieces of the building doors, the frieze, the pieces of the frieze, etc., all line up with some piece of that module. Now, I'm taking a chance here because this is a very difficult building to get to absolute scale because of its size. It's 342 feet long. The building itself is, I better check my notes. "36 feet high. The mound that it sits on, this portion here, is 55 feet. I do believe, though, because I've taken photographs and checked small pieces of this, that the game I'm playing here is correct. In any case, some experts seem to feel that these two pieces were actually added later. And so I put one together without those. And while each piece of this seems to be aesthetically and proportionately pleasing, I don't think as a whole it's very exciting. If you take them out completely and fill them in with what you see on the rest of the building, I think it's even less exciting. So I believe that probably this building was designed this way. Now, whether that's right or wrong is beside the point. It's really the plan of this building that is more important. Or to be more correct, it's the plaza that this particular building sits on. Had this been an Aztec building around Mexico City, probably it would have been laid out this way. So what you see here is the plan of the building, this large plaza, the Great Pyramid, which is not the one you saw earlier, but another pyramid, and this little building which is called the House of the Turtles. But in fact, what has happened at Uxmal is the geometry has been manipulated so that this is the plan we see. The base, or the plaza, is turned. This small building is turned. The pyramid is even turned. So while we have in this Mayan city a central axis that goes from the North Pyramid through the East Court here, primarily most of the pieces of enclosure, such as the West Pyramid and its courtyard, the Pyramid of the Old Woman and its courtyard, this leftover space here made by the Great Pyramid and the Governor's Palace, and so forth, all of these spaces have been manipulated so that, in my opinion, we find that these spaces are much more exciting. Now, there's no way through slides that I can show you that is in fact the case. You can't do that with a slide. You have to go to the space, you have to visit it, you have to walk around it, and you have to say, yes, I do believe this would be more exciting than it would had it been absolutely purely geometrically or 90-degree geometry. A minor point here, this plaza has cisterns underneath it. Uxmal is in a portion of Mexico which is dry. It doesn't rain for about 6 months of the year. Consequently, they stored water underneath this plaza. It has been calculated that the plaza would collect and the cisterns would hold enough water for 5,000 people for 1 year. So I believe if they could do that, they could certainly get all these lines squared up if they wanted them squared up. Incidentally, while we have the plan here, we'll also be looking at this little building, the House of the Turtles, and this quadrangle. This is, as you see there, the House of the Turtles, and the reason it's called that is because these little things sticking out here originally were turtle heads. Now, if we look at this building in plan, we see that it's made up of 3 squares. When divided into thirds, all the walls fall on those pieces. We also find that the building is absolutely symmetrical both in this dimension, that is top and bottom around that point, and in this axis, except for this facade, and that's the one we're looking at. On the left, you see an axon of the way those rooms are made. Structurally, all of the great majority of the buildings during the Mayan classical period were made with corbelled vaults. So what you have here are polished stone infill. Incidentally, that's a tourist. No Mexican would ever dress that way, unless they were in a movie. If you look at this, this is actually from that same building. You can see very clearly how the construction goes together. Finished stones on the surface and the infill. The Mayans had cement, so all the infill is held together with concrete. Maybe not to the standards that we have today, but they're still standing for the most part. Now, it's this facade that I would like to concentrate on for a moment, because some people have said that this building is as sophisticated as many of the Greek temples, and I think I can show you why as we progress through this. Incidentally, on the frieze, this detail here undoubtedly comes from the huts that the Mayans still live in. Incidentally, there are Mayans today. They still speak Mayan language. In fact, if you go to a service station in this part of the Yucatan, you will see first a sign that says no smoking in English. Then above that will be no fumar, which is Spanish for no smoking. Then above that you see ma blitz, which, and I'm not sure that's pronounced right, but I do know they have a lot of Z's and X's. These huts are the way they live today. You can see that there is electrical wire here, so they have electricity in this particular one. If we use these members here as a module and we divide them into 4 pieces, we can see that we can have a major and a minor rhythm occurring in this facade. And we can see that everything falls into place. Well, for those of you who are looking at this carefully, you'll see that that is not really the case at all, but in fact, the same module, everything's the same, except you see here the turtles have been moved. They are not the same as you see here. The doors have been slipped just slightly, so they are not absolutely symmetrical. And it's through that manipulation of the facade that I think you'll see in this next pair of doodles that the one on the right is more sophisticated, more pleasing, is a better facade than the one on the left. This one tends to be, in my opinion, cold, stagnant. This is just the opposite. I hope you can see that, and it's not just my imagination. have A is equal to A, so consequently, make sure I get this right, and I didn't. We find that the width is twice the height, this piece is equal to that piece, these are equal, and so forth. I don't believe, or at least I can't find it, that anything has been manipulated in the vertical, it's only in the horizontal. Again, the building, in case you're wondering, this thing here is a light, because at night they have light shows and people come out and get stabbed and all that. Now, if we look at this building on the side, you will see a group of tourists there. More importantly, in the background, you see the Great Temple. I apologize for the washed out slide. For those that want to see the Great Temple up closer and better photograph, this is from the door on the other side of the small building. Now, what those people are looking at, most likely, is this. And in the foreground you see the ball court. This building here is the nunnery. We'll talk about that in a moment. And this is the Temple of the Magician. Now, the Temple of the Magician is one of the higher pyramids in any of the Mayan cities. The fellow in the red shirt up here, where he is standing, is 100 feet below the ground. That's approximately 10 stories. You can see that the steps here are extremely steep, and what the guide was telling the tourists sitting at the bottom of the House of the Turtles probably was that the reason these steps are so steep is so that when the Mayans killed the virgins and kicked them over the edge, they would go all the way to the bottom. They actually said that. As architects, we probably know that the reason those steps are so steep is because if they were flat, this thing would not be nearly as dramatic as it is with steep steps. And the steps do go on forever. The building in the rear here, or the group of buildings, is called the nunnery. And it's a very important complex of buildings because the building on the east, this one I believe, has a date on it which is 909, which is the last date of the classical period. So consequently, this complex becomes very important. It also has on it some of the most sophisticated sculpture that you find in anywhere in any of the Mayan cities, and that is worth looking at more closely. If you look at it, you'll see that, probably there's a better slide of this, that the way the facades are put together, remember behind this you have rubble and cement that's holding it together, are put together with small stones. They're carved and put together in pieces. If you look closely here, you'll see that these are a series of faces. Eyes, nose, which have been broken. Originally the noses were more like that. And mouth. And you have several of these characters stacked on top of each other. All of these represent small pieces of stone which have all been put together to form this facade. The complex in Axon looks like this. Originally, there were large steps that came up to this door, which you saw a moment ago. Probably this was the first time in history that there were stairs for the handicapped. I can't imagine why they did this other than that. Some are easier than the others. You'll also notice that as you enter the complex, this building is slightly lower than these two buildings. These two are slightly lower than the building to the north. And these two small buildings sit on the large plain or the large court that's inside. The court is the one on the right. Again, probably the Aztecs would have done it this way. The Mayans chose to manipulate that geometry so that no two buildings are parallel to each other, and yet there is very strong geometry here. If we cut any of these buildings through the center, we find that they are all symmetrical. In fact, when I was doing this doodle, for some reason halfway through it I left my, I keep going to the wrong one. I left my drawing board and I came back and I realized that what I'd put down is this. So I just stopped and redid the thing because I thought this was a nice combination of images which show that symmetry. They also show to some degree some of the patterns and rhythms that exist in this group of buildings. Now, again, we have a case where it's very difficult to tell you how wonderful that space is. You must go there. But having been in various plazas in Europe and in the eastern part of this country, there's no doubt that this particular court matches any of them. And it has to do with the fact that things are thrown out of geometry, that is, they are not parallel. The various buildings change in elevation, this one being the lowest, that the highest. And the consequence of that is that the space is just wonderful to be in. The size of it is approximately 200 feet wide and about 180 feet in the grassy portion. Also the fact that the corners leak out. You can pick up pieces of the Mexican sky through the corners. All of this goes together to make this one of the best examples of architecture that I have seen anywhere. Now, for all of you who are looking at Mexican travel information, you invariably see this particular pyramid. It's the large pyramid at Chichen Itza. From the top of this pyramid, if you look east, you will see this large building, which is called the House of the Warriors. This was done after the Mayan classical period, because you see the many columns here. This was a post and beam constructed building, and I'm not sure what it was used for, but anyway, the point is that you can see the architecture changes over what we've seen at Uxmal. Now, if you look the other direction, you see the Great Ball Court. And it's this building that I would like to talk about for a moment, because ball courts were found in all of the Mayan cities, going all the way back to that first one I showed you, the Olmec city. And the slide on the right is taken in the museum in Merida, so it's a drawing. The game is a real weird one because it's played with this ball here, which is a rubber ball made from a certain plant in the Yucatan. The object of the game was to put the ball through this thing, but you could only use your knees, your elbows, your hips. You couldn't use your hands. And according to some of the writings by the Spanish who watched these games, no one hardly ever got the thing through the hoop. So evidently, there were other ways to score points. If anyone ever did get it through the hoop, evidently it was such a celebration that all these people standing on the upper portions there watching it would throw the equivalent of coins and jewelry and so forth to whoever it was that made the goal. If we look at a plan of this, because it's a ball court, obviously it's very symmetrical. And we find that it has obviously an axis in two directions, as most ball courts do. And we find that in this case we have two temples at either end and a temple on the side. Now what I find interesting about this particular court is that in a symmetrical situation, or what you would think would be a symmetrical situation, this temple is obviously placed so that it is asymmetrical. It would be like putting the press box at a football stadium on about the 12 or 15 yard line. But yet, it's my opinion that it must have been done purposefully because it's such an obvious move. If we look at other pieces of this, you can see one of the temples. This is a temple at the north end. Incidentally, the volume of this is about the same as the volume of the other building. So while they're not symmetrical in plan, there is symmetry in their volume. This stonework here is along the bottom portion of the court, and I can't remember what the story is, but has something to do with one team beating another, and the guides would tell you they cut out each other's hearts. I can't believe that. It's kind of like the gladiators in Roman times. It cost a lot of money to have a gladiator, so you didn't go around letting them get killed every Sunday afternoon. Now, what you've been looking at is called the new Chichen Itza, that is, that portion of Chichen Itza which was influenced by the Aztecs and the Toltecs. Across the highway, appropriately, is the old Chichen Itza. And I would like to just simply look at one building here. This was done during the classical period. And the building you see here is the observatory. The plan of that is as you see on the right, and I have gotten my slides out of order again, so I can't be as dramatic. But here again, on the left you see what might have been in one of the Aztec, Toltec, Mixtec cities, and what the Mayans chose to do. Again, without getting too carried away here, this is one of those exciting buildings. And when we look at the upper portion of it, scientists have calculated that these various arrows line up with certain stars, the sun and moon, etc., in certain places. The reason that you see only half of it is because one of the Spanish priests decided that this thing just surely had to be full of gold, so he took some dynamite and blew half of it off. Some of the detailing On the Caribbean side of the Yucatan, I would like to just very quickly show you the only Mayan city which is on the ocean. It's Tulum. And first, a couple of shots of the ocean. Probably the slides need no description. What you see on the left is a little inlet. On the right is not the ocean, but in fact a freshwater lagoon, and there are many all up and down the eastern side of Yucatan. Tulum is a walled city, so to enter it you come up through this hole in the wall, and here you see a building that hangs out over the Caribbean. Some of the other buildings, incidentally, this is not built during the classical period, but was built much later. And I don't think, other than it being on the Caribbean, it's all that exciting a place. The reason I show it to you is for this reason. These tourists are all gathered around here looking at what you see here. And for all practical purposes, it's the only place in the northern Yucatan where you can find any of the fresco work still remaining on any of the buildings. And that's what you see there. The color is not correct because it's taken inside the building, but you can see some of the painting. Now, I think it's appropriate that I wind this thing up by talking about two little projects that I have done. And I know that some of you probably noticed that I wear cowboy boots every now and then. I just want you to know that some of us are really cowboys. At least we've done all the things that cowboys do. That is, rope calves and ride horses and sit down in cactus. This slide is taken on a ranch in West Texas which belongs to Susan's family. And last summer, this group of people on the left, which is the immediate family, all 18 from age 12 to 72, decided that we would all get together and build something. So what we built was a gate. And it was really a nice experience because every day we would get up very early in the morning. It's extremely hot in Texas in the summertime. We'd get up early in the morning and we'd go work on this thing till noon. Then we would all go back and swim on the river, have lunch, sit around and talk, play cards, drink beer. And in the evening there usually be some people come out from town and play instruments and sing and dance and have a good time. So over a period of 4 days we built that gate, and it involved bringing the stone down from one of the high pastures over here, obviously putting all the stone together, making the gates and so forth. Now, you'll notice that there's some very large pipe here, and this pipe is some leftover from a drilling rig that was there many years ago. Obviously they didn't strike oil or I wouldn't be here, I'd be back in the Yucatan, but that's where the large pipe came from. Everything you see here came from the ranch. All this is scrap metal, etc. Now, we got so excited about doing this and we were so pleased with it that we decided that we would plan and build something, maybe not this coming summer, but the summer after. So we decided a pavilion would be the thing to have down by the river. So programmatically, what you see on the right here is a large square which represents an area for standing around, dancing, eating, two half circles which represent just simply seating areas, this circle which is raised slightly and represents a place for musicians. This square is a storage building. All the cooking, incidentally, at least in the summertime, takes place outside, and that's merely an entry step. So if you look at that in plan, again, it's made from stone. And you can see that the form is very much what came about in the original design. Incidentally, these dots here represent some more of that large pipe. For the building, we decided that the thing to do was to build it also from things we could find on the ranch. So the wall is all stone. The roof is made of corrugated barn tin, but turned the wrong direction. And what you see here was the first kind of geometric form of that, and then make sure I do this right. I began to manipulate that first by splitting the roof and shoving one half up, and then, without making too much out of this, by moving one window so that the geometry of this was shifted somewhat from what it started out from. And again, in elevation, you see here the pipe painted this ochre color, the trim around here, the roof. In section, the tin is held up with round fence posts which are set in the stone. There's a removable awning that sits on top of those posts. You can see some of the stone. And if you look at that in axon, you can better understand it. You can see the seats, the raised piece here, so forth. And in model form, you see that the forms are very pure. The columns add a few people. In fact, on the right, add a whole lot of people. Look at it in elevation. And here you see it without and with the awning. And the last slide you see here is what happens if it rains. Thank you very much. If anyone would like to ask questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. If not, I guess it's Miller time then.